Well, Bev, it began in a really major shopping centre called the World Trade Centre in Causeway Bay on Hong Kong Island. About lunchtime local time, it appears from the reports that it started on one of the lower levels where some sort of construction or renovation work was taking place. And for throughout the afternoon, there were conflicting media reports out of Hong Kong suggesting that at a certain point there were more than 300 people still trapped inside on an upper level. Many of those were trapped up on the 39th floor. Now, in the last few hours, I'm seeing reports of at least 13 people injured. So we're still trying to get a more complete picture of the current situation, but for a while there was an emergency situation where clearly hundreds of people were caught up in this.
Let's pivot to China, Bill, where Omicron is making an appearance. We've seen a couple of cases now emerge, but it is battling more serious outbreaks, not of Omicron, but in another 3 cities.
Yeah, so it's only 2 cases, both in hotel quarantine, or one of the cases of Omicron was a fellow in Guangdong province who was in home isolation. So in other words, it's come from overseas and, the system works. It's been caught before these people have gone back into the community. But you've actually had a more substantial outbreak once again in the east. In Zhejiang province, for example, you've had a couple of hundred cases recorded this week. Now, I know when you look at Sydney or Melbourne, a couple of hundred cases sounds pretty good. And for a country with China's population, it sounds incredibly good. But given that China maintains a very strict zero tolerance policy, it is a bit of a disaster for any of those local officials to be presiding over any form of outbreak, even if it's relatively small. And at the moment, we're going into the middle of winter in China. Of course, that's a season when you'd expect the spread of the virus to be a little bit more easy to spread. But also, too, you have the Beijing Winter Olympics coming up in February next year. So it's not the time when Chinese officials would feel very comfortable about having outbreaks in different parts of the country. And I suspect in the lead up to Beijing, we'll only see a further ramping up of these zero tolerance measures to try and stamp it out.
And to that point, has the crackdown and the shutdown been very immediate? How is it impacting people's lives?
Well, there's quite a pattern now when there are localised outbreaks for officials to basically undertake compulsory mass testing in those cities. In China, it's quite possible to do this because most people live in gated communities in these residential developments called xiaoqu. They all have the equivalent of a strata committee running them. And so there are staff or volunteers who are able to go door to door to basically compel people to be tested. But the infrastructure's there, the staffing is there, they're able to set up very quick testing facilities. So this has been quite effective in the past. We've seen many sporadic outbreaks in different cities of China, including the Delta variant. It's not probably a case of whether or not these current outbreaks can be squashed, but the bigger problem of how on earth do you continue this zero tolerance policy for such a long time when you know that sporadic outbreaks are going to keep popping up?
And that's such a good point because, of course, the rest of the world is trying to go about a living with COVID policy. And you talk about the Beijing Winter Olympics when people are going to be coming in. So how tolerant are they going to be to potentially big outbreaks?
Well, not very tolerant because after the Beijing Olympics, the end of next year, around about November or so, is the 20th Party Congress. These are once every 5-year meetings. They are major reshuffles of political power at the top. And it's such a sort of big, sensitive event that you could not imagine that Xi Jinping and the communist leadership would want to change policy and allow some sort of living with the virus before that meeting happens. So there's an expectation in China and also in Hong Kong too, where they now have a zero tolerance policy, that there won't be any change in that policy until late next year at the earliest. And just quickly, Bev, you mentioned the Beijing Winter Olympics. We saw confirmation this week that for Chinese volunteers or media staff or whoever, who go into the bubble, who work for 2 weeks or so at the Olympics, when they come out of the bubble, they will have to quarantine in some sort of hotel facility or similar for 21 days. And of course, many of the people who do that are Beijingers. And so you'll have Beijingers quarantining for 21 days in their own city, which they never even left in the first place.
Quite an unusual policy. Thanks, Bill. As always, good to talk.
Thanks, Beth.